All right, thanks everyone for coming in. My name is Mike Lozano. My call sign is K0NGA. I'm a member of RMHAM, Rocky Mountain Ham Radio, and I do a lot of the front-end education around DMR Basics. I have lost count now of how many times I've given this presentation, and I do also maintain many of the non-Motorola code plugs that you see on our website. What we're going to go through tonight, since we have about an hour, and we want to make sure that we do the best of everybody's time, is to go through a bottom-up basics for hams who are new to DMR, who are just getting into the hobby, and who may either have just bought their first radio, haven't bought their first radio, may just be getting interested into this. So this is kind of a ground-up course. Normally, we give this presentation as part of RMHAM University that is going to be starting up pretty soon. However, doing it once a year we felt was no longer adequate because we have people coming into the DMR as part of the hobby often, and doing this kind of presentation only once a year was not meeting a lot of people's needs. So we decided to try this webinar format in order to get more of these presentations and more of these discussions out to hams as they come in, and also to serve as a foundation for the DMR class, which we'll now give as part of RMHAM University, which will be just a little bit more advanced into next level topics within DMR. So welcome, and thanks everybody for coming. Now, whenever I give a DMR talk or presentation, I always like to start out with a statement. And I call that the DMR doctrine. And it goes something like this. First of all, the first thing to understand about DMR, especially for hams, is that DMR was created for commercial use. Okay? This DMR is not a ham radio protocol. It never was a ham radio protocol, and it will, in all likelihood, never be a amateur radio protocol. So that's the first concept that you need to understand. Okay? It wasn't designed for hams. It was never intended when the protocol was being created. It was never intended for amateur radio use. Okay? Now, because of that, some things about DMR, at least up front, are not going to make sense. They're just not. Just accept it. It will make your life a lot easier. Okay? It's going to be a little different if you're coming in from analog amateur radio. This is going to be, very confusing, at least up front. We'll try to smooth the transition, which is what this presentation partly is for. If you're coming in from D-Star or from Fusion, same thing. It's a different animal. Okay? So try to go in this with an open mind. Try not to make comparisons between them, because it'll make it harder for you to grasp the concepts. Just let that go, and we're going to basically start over from scratch. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what DMR is, what the concepts within the repeater are, because when you understand how a repeater works, you understand how the radio works, and what's new and what isn't. There are some things that aren't terribly new, so you don't have to relearn everything, but most stuff is. We're going to talk about the basics of programming a channel, what it takes to put a channel together, what the radio is expecting, what the repeater is expecting, the order in which that needs to be done to make your life easier, and how to get that into your radio. And then we'll take a brief look at what you can expect going ahead as to what's next once you can program your radio and what you have to look forward to. All right. First thing, what is this thing? What is DMR? And by association, you may have heard this term TRBO, TRBO. What the heck is that? All right. First and foremost, DMR stands for Digital Mobile Radio. It's probably the simplest thing you're going to learn tonight. Digital Mobile Radio, which is an international commercial digital radio standard that originated in Europe. It's created by the ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, if I remember that correctly. So this standard came into the commercial radio world from Europe. Now, TRBO is a shortened version of Moto Turbo, which is Motorola's implementation of the DMR standard. Now, something to keep in mind here is that many amateur radio repeater networks, including RMHAM, including DMR Mark. There's a lot also in Brandmeister. Use Moto Turbo equipment, okay, which is why they are sometimes referred to as turbo networks. That was certainly the case with our network. We no longer refer to our network as a turbo network, but sometimes the old terminology still shows up in older code plugs or in some of the materials that we put out. So we want to let you know that this is why that's there. It is important also to understand you do not need to use a Motorola Moto Turbo radio to use these networks. Hallelujah. Now, you can. They are great radios. They are, you know, they cost a lot, but they're worth the money, especially if you're going to be, if you're in a tough environment and tend to abuse your equipment out of necessity. But certainly not necessary for one of these radios to use our networks. You can use a more affordable radio than that. All right. So now we start getting into some of the deeper tech, okay? This is a very, very rough approximation of the difference between the DMR radio system and other radio systems, okay? So the way that some systems work, especially Fusion and D-Star I need to get more in depth on, is you're combining two repeaters with combining equipment and using separate frequencies, okay? Now, DMR works in a very, very different way. DMR uses a technology called TDMA, Time Division Multiplexing. I forget what the A stands for, if Chris or William can remind me at some point. But the way that this works is that you have a repeater that has a standard frequency pair, like you're used to in any other repeater, okay? But it splits the time, which is why it's called time division multiplexing, between two virtual slots in the repeater, okay? Now, the end user experience on that is that you can actually have two separate conversations going on the same repeater at the same time, using the same input and output frequencies, okay? So this one repeater, very, very simply, can act as if it is two separate repeaters, okay? It's very, very important to understand this because when you start looking at programming your radio, you have to specify things and you have to know which slot you want to be on, and you have to know, you know, besides just the frequency pair. If you have a channel that is programmed to operate on one slot and the person you're trying to communicate with his channel is programmed to communicate on the other slot, the two of you very likely will not be able to communicate. There are some very, very finicky exceptions to that, but these exceptions, of course, are not ideal. The best experience, of course, and the easiest way to make sure that everything goes smoothly is for the two of you to be communicating on the same repeater slot when you are communicating being the same repeater, okay? But the cool thing is that now you can use one frequency pair and get the functionality of two separate repeaters. You could have somebody on slot, you know, two people having a conversation on slot 1, while two other people are having a conversation on slot 2, and the two of you aren't interfering with each other. The conversation is going on at the same time, but the repeater is using the same frequency pair. Now, these repeaters have become very, very popular in amateur radio, not just for that, but because of another interesting little tidbit that comes into play. Because these are commercial repeaters, this is commercial equipment, commercial standards, these repeaters use narrow band frequencies, okay? Now, traditional amateur radio equipment uses wideband frequencies. So if you have a wideband, theoretically, if you have a wideband allocation, you can actually split that, theoretically, into two different allocations that are only 12.5 kilohertz apart. And you could fit two repeater pairs in that same wideband slot. So now, not only can you have two repeaters in the same wideband slot, but you can have two conversations going on per repeater. So whereas before with your analog amateur radio equipment, you could only support one conversation at a time, now if you have the equipment, you could support up to 4 simultaneous conversations at a time. And that is part of the reason why this DMR technology has become very, very popular. So that is a very, very brief rundown of the differences between how a DMR repeater works and an analog repeater works. Now, these signals are digital, so you're not sending, really FM type signals. You're sending packets. You're sending ones and zeros. All right, and those ones and zeros are like I said, they're organized into packets, and that packet then is translated by the repeater into audio signals. There's also some metadata information that gets sent. We'll go into where that comes into play as we get into the programming. But the upside to that is that as long as that repeater can distinguish between ones and zeros being transmitted by your radio, the audio signal sounds the same. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can get more range out of your radio, but it does mean that that you will be readable for longer into that range, because your readability doesn't degrade as your signal gets worse, because the ones and zeros are ones and zeros, and as long as I can tell a 0 from a 1, it's going to sound the same. So it'll get readable a lot further out, and then eventually it'll just drop off. You hear some people calling about someone going digital or sounding like R2D2. That's when the signal gets distorted, because you're now outside of that range and the ones and zeros start to get garbled. So it is clearer longer, and because you're sending out digital information, your voice comes across clearer as well as compared to an analog radio. All right, at this point I'm going to pause for questions. First of all, Chris, do we have any questions in the chat?
We have no questions in the chat. TDMA is time division multiple access.
Multiple access, thank you. Very good. So if there's a question that you'd like to ask on the audio, please go ahead and unmute yourself now. Otherwise, we will continue to the next slide. Okay, excellent. So let's talk about some concepts as to how this plays out when you're starting to program your radio and create a channel. So the first thing that you need to program a channel is a frequency pair. Now, this isn't new. This is fantastic. So you don't have to worry about new concepts and frequency pairs. What you may see, though, is some frequencies that are a little odd, like 0.6125. So the numbers go out further. And that's because now, instead of doing 25 kilohertz or whatnot frequency divisions, we're doing 12.5 kilohertz. So you may see some really odd frequency pairs. As far as that's concerned, it's normal. Just, program what the website or what the information tells you to say. It'll be fine. Now, the first line into the repeater, is that the order that I went in? Yes, very good, is what's called the color code. Now, the color code functions similar to a tone, either a digital tone or an audio tone or whatever, the DCS or CTCSS tone, but it's not a tone because it's information. Again, I mentioned everything's transmitted in packets. This is information that's in a digital packet that the repeater interprets. So there's no actual tone involved, which is called a color code. Now, the odd thing about it is that the color code isn't expressed as a color. It's expressed as a number. So you'll see color code 0, color code 1, color code 7, color code 6, color code 8, whatever. You'll need that when you program your channel. Now, this works for the exact same. It has the exact same purpose as a tone, where it allows for multiple repeaters to be in the same area on the same frequency pair, but then allows you to control access in. So one company could be using one color code on the frequency pair. Another company could use another frequency code on the same frequency pair, and the two wouldn't interfere with each other. So it serves the same function. So that first bit into the repeater is the color code. Okay. Next thing is the repeater slot. As I mentioned before, the repeater has 2 slots, and you have to specify when you're programming the channel which slot you want to communicate on. So you do have to specify that in the channel. Okay. If you are transmitting on repeater slot 1, somebody on repeater slot 2 will not hear you. Okay. It's very, very important to understand. if you're on the same repeater, and we'll talk about in linked systems and linked repeaters is for another presentation. But assuming your two radios accessing the same repeater, you need to be on the same repeater slot in order to communicate. Okay, so that's important. So you have to specify color code and then a repeater slot. Next thing. This is where things get really interesting, and that is the talk group. Now, the talk group, again, is just a number. You can put a label to it, and you'll see this a lot. Even in our network, we have our north talk group, our south talk group, our central talk group. Those talk groups are associated with a number, okay? Each repeater slot can be further subdivided by talk groups. So I could have talk group 3, talk group 5, talk group 7, all three of those talk groups on programmed as being viable on one of the repeater slots in the repeater. And in that case, if you are trying to transmit to somebody, you need to be sending and receiving on the same repeater slot. Generally, again, there's some advanced exceptions to that, but for the purposes of how DMR is supposed to work, you need to be transmitting on the same repeater slot. Now, only one conversation can be going on the same repeater slot at the same time, regardless of how many talk groups are on it. So if somebody's talking on repeater slot 1 and they're talking on talk group 100, if someone comes on to repeater slot 1 and tries to transmit on 200, they're going to get a busy signal because somebody else is already using that repeater slot. Okay? Now, this is one of those things that really doesn't make sense for hams. Why would they do this? It seems kind of weird. And this is where you have to go back and remember that DMR is a commercial radio technology. This protocol was designed for commercial use, for businesses to use as telecommunications within their business, whether it be for a manufacturing plant or for truckers or vehicles out on the road. It was designed for that kind of use. So you would have your two repeater slots. You would have a priority slot. You'd have a non-priority slot, which would be shared amongst different groups within the business. So that's what it was designed for. It was not designed for amateur radio use, and that's why it can be somewhat confusing. Now, this gets used in various different ways. RMHAM has a very, very simple concept. The concept is keep it simple. So in our design, we only have one talk group per repeater slot on any given repeater. So we have one talk group on repeater slot 1, one talk group on repeater slot 2, and amongst the different repeaters in our network, those talk groups are labeled so that you know which general geographic area that talk group is going to be broadcast out on. That's the way we design our network. The other side of that spectrum is things like Brandmaster, where there's billions of talk groups, it seems, certainly several thousand talk groups, different talk groups. And you can get onto any talk group on any repeater at any time. It's a wholly different concept when you start talking about linked repeater systems. Again, that is a topic for a more advanced class. But the upside to this is that talk group concept is extremely flexible and can be used for very, very different ways and used in remarkable ways and awesome ways. The downside is that it's very flexible and can be very confusing if you don't know how the specific repeater that you're getting into works. So for the purposes of this talk, this is the concept. You need these things in order to program your radio. You need to know the frequency pair of the repeater. You need to know the color code of the repeater. You need to know which talk group you want to talk on and which repeater slot it's on. And with this information, you can program a channel. Questions here in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Nothing in the chat, Mike.
Okie doke. All right. Now, associated with the talk group is something called the receive group. Okay? A receive group can be one or more talk groups. So when you program a channel, whatever you set the channel talk group to is what is the channel that you will transmit on. And then whatever channels or whatever talk groups you have in your receive group is what talk groups will cause the audio of your radio to key up when it receives. Now, again, this seems a little odd, a little alien in the amateur radio world, but remember, in a commercial world, more than one talk group may be specified for your particular business use. And by having more than one talk group and a receive group, that allows you to monitor traffic on other talk groups so that you can be sure that the repeater slot is free before you transmit. So you don't want to interrupt a conversation that's going on between another group before you key up and talk to your particular group if there's already a conversation going on. So that's why the receive group works in that way. So frequency pair, color code, repeater slot, talk group, receive group. Those are the foundations of a DMR channel. Okay, to get online, the first thing you need is a radio. Seems pretty straightforward. There are different types of radios on the market. Some of them are approved for commercial use. Some aren't. You have to be very, very careful. Anything that is available for commercial use, you can use for amateur radio use. The reverse is not true. So you see some of these radios, the Anytones, the Connect systems, they have been on the market for amateurs for a long time, but those radios, especially early on and currently some of them still, are not approved for commercial use. So you have to be very, very careful if you're planning on using it for dual purpose. Make sure the radio that you buy is approved for commercial use if you're going to use it on a commercial system. Be very, very careful, okay? There are some radios that are set up as Tier 1 and Tier 2. I believe Tier 1 is one slot is for voice and one slot is for data. The tier that you want for most amateur radio, and of course every repeater is different, for the vast majority though of amateur radio, you want a Tier 2 radio, which is voice on both slots. Okay, these are very, very, very common. Anytime you see a general radio out there saying it's an amateur radio, so the Connect Systems radio, the Anytone radios, the Titeras, should be a Tier 2 radio. Now, there's been some notable exceptions to this where you've got a company that's trying to get in super cheap, and they'll say it's Tier 1 and Tier 2 compatible, and what it really is a Tier 1 radio that's transmitting on both repeater slots at the same time. That's a very bad thing. In amateur radio terms, that's called interference, unintentional or otherwise. We do have some examples up on our website that were very, very bad, egregious examples. We haven't seen one come out like that in a while, though, thank goodness. So generally speaking, you know, ask around. But if we have a code plug available for a radio, that radio is good to go as far as use for amateur radio. Now that we don't have a code plug out there for every possible radio that'll work. But if we have a code plug for it, you can be pretty much assured that it's going to work fine and not cause interference. So a Tier 2 DMR radio, you cannot use an amateur radio analog only radio to get on DMR, onto a DMR repeater. A D-Star radio will not work on a DMR repeater. A Fusion radio will not work on a DMR repeater. Now, just for full disclosure, there are some DMR repeaters, the Moto Turbo ones as well, that have a kind of a carryover mode where you can do an analog channel as well as DMR, but you have to be sure that that repeater is set up that way, or else it won't work that way. So if it's set up for DMR only, your analog radio won't work. And remember, since this is commercial equipment, it must be narrowband. So something to keep in mind. So the first thing is to get a radio that speaks DMR. Okay. Generally speaking, you get what you pay for. The cheaper the radio, the cheaper the radio. Like I said, the Motorola's are really, really fantastic radios. They are not cheap, but you cannot go wrong with the Motorola radios. There is a plethora of available radios out on the market now. Some of them are even being sold by HRO. If you have a relationship with HRO, there's radios you can get, DMR radios you can buy at HRO now. So it's to the point where it's that ubiquitous. So you can get a radio pretty much anywhere now. Okay. Not all radios are created equal. Ask around for user experience. Me in my position, I try not to put out a recommendation. I will tell you offline what I use, and if I've had a bad experience with the radio, I'll say that offline. But I don't discuss that in open forum, or especially in something that's going to be recorded. Check the radio list at RMHAM or at the clubs. Again, if a club has a code plug for it, generally speaking, it's going to be something that's not going to cause problems. Okay. Feature sets can vary widely. All right. Used to be that Roam was the thing that everybody wanted. Now we have DMR radios that can do various forms of APRS. So again, know what you want, ask around for what's available, and buy accordingly. Okay. Choice of radio is mainly a matter of what is important to you. I'm a contact list junkie. I'll explain a little bit later about what that actually means. But I will not buy a DMR radio for myself now that doesn't have the capacity to hold a large contact list. That's just me. Okay. Doesn't mean that they won't function. Doesn't mean that they're not quality radios. That's just a feature that I insist on. Any questions here? You can unmute your mic or ask in the chat. Okay. Now, there is this piece of software on the internet by a guy named N0GSG. That's his call sign. It was called, and still I think it's still called, the Contact List Manager. This software has morphed into something that goes far beyond just contact list management. It will do code plug translation. It'll do code plug management of the entire code plug. My personal recommendation to you, since it's freeware, but it's donationware, is to go to this website, make use of the utility, and throw money at this guy so he continues to maintain it. It is fantastic, and I personally would not seem as awesome as I can sometimes seem without that software, to be completely honest. It is fantastic. Go support the guy. All right. Now, next thing about DMR that we need to understand is that since it's a digital technology, there is going to be something here that is completely new as far as is concerned. Now, it's similar to using your call sign in D-Star, but again, this is not an amateur radio technology, right? So the concept of using your call sign as an identifier digitally doesn't apply. Okay, so in commercial world, the call sign is assigned to the company, not to individuals. So you need to get a radio ID. A radio ID is just a unique identifier for your radio. Now, the good thing is there's an organization that does this for you, and it maintains a list. It's radioid.net. It used to be part of DMR Mark, but they split it off separately. It's a group of guys. All you do is you go to the site, you register for a new ID, you put in your address, your call sign, and whatnot, and within about 24 hours, I don't think it's ever taken longer than 24 hours. Usually it's like within a couple of hours, they'll respond to you with a unique radio ID. And then you can take that radio ID, put it into your radio, and it's because you have to have that radio ID in your radio for something to work. You can use a random number until you get your radio ID, but you still have the chance, if you do that, of kind of mowing over somebody else. So, and you can get your ID before you get your radio. That's fine. It's perfectly allowable, and we do recommend that. But you get your unique ID, and so you can put it into your radio. Everything works better when every radio on the system has a unique ID. If we have duplicate IDs between radios, things start to get kind of funky, and we want to avoid the funkiness as much as possible. Okay, so we'll get into this a little bit more about detail, but the way that these radios are programmed is through software, and there's a configuration file that is created during the process. It's generally called a code plug. It's really just a computer file. So you need, when you say put the ID in your code plug, that means go into the software, find where you need to put the radio ID in, put in your radio ID, and save the file. And then once you have everything configured and ready to go, there's a button that you push that pushes that configuration file up to your radio. Okay, so you put the radio ID in your code plug. Now here's the important thing to understand. Your radio ID is not a replacement for IDing audibly. Okay, because you're only transmitting a radio ID when you key up and not a call sign, it is still required legally for you to vocally ID your call sign every 10 minutes, just like you would with a regular analog radio. Okay, I don't see that going away anytime soon, just because, again, anybody can spoof a radio ID if they really want to get nasty about it, right? So we still want that, that radio ID, the vocalization of your call sign, in order to keep everything clean and legal, right? You'll hear some people that have differing opinions on this. If you talk to your ARRL representatives, they will tell you very differently. You do need to vocally ID. We really don't want that kind of friction with the FCC. Just do it. It'll be okay. All right. Now, I mentioned sample CODEPLUGS. We do have sample CODEPLUGS on our website. There are other clubs that maintain sample CODEPLUGS as well. Under our website, they're under the sample CODEPLUGS page. We try to make sure that all of those CODEPLUGS have all the RMHAM repeaters plugged in, programmed in, obviously, because it's our CODEPLUG. This is the quickest way to get on the air. All right, so you can get the CODEPLUG in. Make sure you put your radio ID in, put it up in your radio, tune to a channel, and connect in and start getting transmitting. It's the quickest way to get on the air. They're also intended to be as a starting point for you to learn how to program your own radio. Okay. We want you to learn how to program your radio. There's not a single person, myself included, who can go and create a custom CODEPLUG for everybody that comes through. It's just not feasible, right? So if you can program your own radio, add your own channels, especially if you travel, that is the absolute best way to make sure that you get what you need. But these CODEPLUGs can absolutely be used as a learning tool and as a foundation for starting your own CODEPLUG. We strongly encourage you to do that, all right? You can also use our CODEPLUGs if we don't have a CODEPLUG for the radio that you have, but the N0 GSG utility supports the radio that you bought. You can take one of our CODEPLUGs and convert it to the CODEPLUG for your radio using that utility, okay? I think right now the one that we most commonly get asked is about the CS800D. Everybody's very surprised that you can't use a CS800 CODEPLUG and a CS800D. I don't know why they differentiated it out. It's just part of the way that things work. But you can use the N0 GSG utility to convert from the 800 to the 800D. It works fine. All right. Now, the software that's in the slide here is the Connect System software. This is for the 700 and the 750 and the 800. And under General Settings, there is actually a box that says Radio ID. And that's where you put in the radio ID. And that's one of my radio IDs. More on that later. You do not need more than one radio ID for each radio. You do not need more than one radio ID if you're going to be on different networks. So if you're going to be an RMHAM, Brandmeister, DMR Mark, you do not need more than one radio ID. The same radio ID will work on every network. The key there is to make sure you're only using one radio at a time. There are very, very few people that I know that use more than one radio at a time. I do because I do testing and for radios and whatnot when I'm doing CODEPLUGs, so I have more than one ID. But the vast majority of people will only need the one ID. You do not have to get multiple IDs. It's absolutely not necessary. Now, this is the Connect System software. If I go over to here, this is the Anytone software. And I use the Anytone software for two reasons. One, because the Anytone radios are becoming very popular. And two, because they do some things very differently in the software from other manufacturers, and it gets extremely confusing, okay? So the way that they do this is the radio ID is found under the digital section, and it's in the section called Radio ID List. What this allows you to do is to pre-program in more than one radio ID into your radio, and then when you're in the field, you can switch between your radio IDs while you're out and about. This is one of those features that 99% of hams will never use, but it's there. So the way this, you put in your radio ID here, you double click it, radio ID 3108111, and I'm just gonna put the K0NGA mic as the label, click OK. Now that radio ID is in my software. That's all you need to do. You do not have to have more than one radio ID to use in Anytone. That's silly. But they do it differently, and so you'll see some other things as well as we go through the evening. So that's radio ID. If there's any questions on radio ID, please go ahead and speak up. Either unmute or put a question in the chat. Quiet group tonight. All right. So let's program a channel. Now that we have our radio ID in. So this is a little fun quote from me. To experience true DMR freedom, you must learn to program your radio yourself. I don't have enough hours in the day. All right. So we talked about what you need to program the radio. This is a example from the Connect System software of what a single channel programming screen looks like. So you have there the channel alias. That's just a name for the channel. If you have your screen set to show the channel name, which most people do, this is what will show up on the display when you tune to this channel. Okay. The digital ID there, I believe, will repeat whatever you have in the radio ID section. That'll show up there as well. So it's set to 1 there because this is a brand new, fresh code plug from scratch. You'll see there circled the color code and the repeater slot. One of the first things on the channel. Scan list is an advanced topic. Don't get me started. Okay, so on the left side is the receive side of the channel. You've got a frequency. So you'd set that to the transmit frequency of the repeater, and the radio will receive the transmit signal. Okay, don't get those backwards. And then you see below there's the receive group list. So that's the receive list that you select for the receive side of the channel. On the right side, you have the transmit frequency. So you set the transmit frequency to the receive frequency of the repeater. And then down there's the TX contact. That's the talk group that you want to transmit on. Okay, so this is blank. This is what you first see when you have first set up a Connect System software. You open it up for the first time and look at the default channel. This is what you see. Okay. Now in the Anytone software, it looks a little different. So if we go up the channel here, it has some example channels already in there. In order to program a channel, you need to double click a blank one, or if you want to see what they have set up, you can just double click here. And this is what you see. So you have a channel name, transmit and receive frequency pairs, the frequency correction, don't worry about that right now. What is important here is down here, there's this channel type, digital. You can do analog or digital. There's also this analog plus digital transmit, the analog transmit. Don't worry about those for now. That's more stuff for another day. Digital is what you really want to do for DMR. Transmit power, everybody should know about transmit power. High, technically you're supposed to put the minimum amount, but who knows what the minimum amount's going to be. Bandwidth is important. You need to leave this at 12.5K for DMR, because all DMR is 12.5K. That's narrow band. Okay. Some of the other stuff we'll go into later. What's really important over here is the digital section here. Okay. So you can actually select a radio ID per channel. Again, 99% of people aren't going to do that, but you can see I set up that already. The default one shows up here. Here is your color code. Here is the repeater slot. Here is your receive group. Now on the Anytone, what trips up a lot of people is where do you put in the transmit contact or the transmit of the talk group? That's up here in this contact, and for whatever reason, Anytone implemented this as a push button. So you click the button, and then you choose from these selections up here, and then that becomes selected in. I don't know why they did that just for that contact. I'm sure somebody had a really good reason for it, but that's where it is. And we'll show a little bit more about that as we get later on into things here. All right. So that's what a channel looks like. So let's go through these components one by one. Then we build it up, because the order does matter if you want to keep from pulling your hair out. Color code, we talked about the color code, right? There's a drop down to choose a color code. Choose the one that is specified wherever you're getting the information from. Like our repeater information is on the website. If you were doing this from scratch, there would be a listing in the table for that particular repeater. It would tell you what color code to set it to. Just set it to the right color code. Okay. Next is the contact list. Now, the contact list is implemented differently in different radios. You have one of three things in the contact list: private calls for radio IDs, talk groups, for which is required for most repeaters. That allows us to do group calls kind of thing, and then something called all call. All right. Now, let's talk about talk groups first, because talk groups is what are we going to be using most often or not. You would put in, again, it's just a number and a label, right? For example, 700 Rocky Mountain, okay? That's all it is. Now, like most things where you interact with computers and humans, the computers talk numbers, the humans talk labels, right? So as long as you understand what you're doing, right? If you need to do on Rocky Mountain, you need to use the talk group number 700. As long as you have that labeled correctly and you know what you're doing, that's what counts. Okay. Now, let's talk about some individual things. It is possible in the DMR specification to transmit to a private call, to a radio ID. And in that case, only the radio of the person with that radio ID only their speaker will open up when that gets transmitted. It's important to understand that this is not in the spirit of amateur radio. Amateur radio was never designed to be point-to-point. It's supposed to be broadcast, okay? So on our RMHAM system, we ask you very, very politely up front not to do direct radio ID calls on our network. Only use talk groups, okay? We will call you and talk to you if you decide to do that. What you're doing basically is you're tying up an entire repeater system for an individual contact. We ask you again strongly not to do that. It does tend to interfere. Use talk groups all you want. Talk as much as you want on our network on talk groups and whatnot, but please don't use private calls. Okay. All call is, again, part of the specification. And again, these things exist because this is a commercial radio standard. All call is kind of an emergency thing. So when you do all call, anyone that is listening on the same repeater slot, regardless of what you have your radio set to in the receive group, the speaker will open up. And that is for emergency calls, as you can imagine, right? Now, here's the other thing about the radio IDs. We do, you know, and a lot of people do this. I know I do because I'm a junkie. Do put the radio IDs in the contact list, but we don't do it for transmit. We do it because if you have that radio ID and a label next to it in the contact list, when that person transmits and your radio receives it, the label will show up in your screen instead of the radio ID. And that'll allow you to see that, you know, by default is the way that we set this up, is the person's call sign and their name in the screen. Now, it's important to understand that this has to be programmed into your radio for that to work. Okay, the repeater does not transmit the call sign and the name. The repeater only transmits the radio ID of the person that's transmitting. Okay, your radio, if it's in the contact list, translates the radio ID to this label. Okay, and there are certain radios that allow a very, very easy import of all this information from radioid.net. And again, that's one of the things that I use to determine what radio I use is the radios that have that feature. Okay, it's really, really cool. All right, I'm going to pause here for questions.
Mike, we do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
It seems to be requesting clarification on which of these fields map to existing concepts. If you can pull up the chat and redo that.
Yeah. Okay. If you were to draw a block diagram or org chart of how all the pieces map, for example, what maps to channel, what the users map to, and what the frequencies map to, there really isn't one because it's all new concepts. Again, the only concept that that translates between all different radio technologies is the frequency pair. Everything else is kind of new. The color code generally, you know, compares to, like I said, to a CTCSS or a DCS tone or a PL tone, right? Everything else doesn't have a comparative thing in analog technology. It just doesn't. All these things are very, very new. There's no such thing as a contact list. in an analog amateur radio. And there really isn't a contact list in D-Star because the D-Star specification transmits the call sign as part of the protocol, whereas DMR does not. DMR only transmits the radio ID. So it'd be extremely difficult to come up with something anywhere near, really useful in that regard, sadly. Other questions? Feel free to put it in the chat or to unmute. Wait a few more seconds here. Okay. So in this contact list, we're putting private calls, which are radio IDs, talk groups, which are also called group calls, and all call. Okay, that's what can go in there. Okay. So as I said before, talk groups are another kind of access control level at the slot level, with the repeater slot or time slot. Repeater slot and time slot are used interchangeably. They're the same thing. But again, you can only have one conversation going on a repeater slot at any given time. Okay? So if your repeater uses talk groups, and the vast majority of them do, you have to know which talk groups the repeater uses in order to use the repeater effectively. All right? So talk groups are assigned to a repeater slot. It is extraordinarily rare, and I've never actually seen this done, where you have the same talk group on both repeater slots. It's just not a concept, really. So if you want to go in a talk group and you're going to a repeater that has that talk group, you need to also note which repeater slot that talk group is assigned to. Okay. Now, you can have more than one talk group on a repeater slot, as I said before, but only one talk group can be using the slot at any given time. Okay. This is where things get really confusing. In the earlier days of DMR, there was a lot of organizations around the United States, a lot of clubs that would just put, half a dozen or more talk groups on a repeater slot. And they learned really quickly that that's a recipe for chaos. It's really, really not usable that way. Okay. Now, in the Connect System software, this is what a contact list looks like. You have the contact name. Again, that's just a label. A group call is a talk group. A private call is a radio ID. And then you have the number. Okay. The receive tone is the thing that's specific to that radio. You can have a different tone for each one of these when they key in, so you can tell, by tone who's calling and whatnot. But the label, the call type, and the ID. It's just a list. Okay. Now it's important that we do the contact list first, because until you have a talk group in the contact list, you can't assign a talk group to a channel. Okay. If you remember looking at the channel from the presentation and also the channel in the Anytone software, you are selecting from an existing set of talk groups. The contact list is where that list comes from. Okay. So in order to make things go smoothly and to keep from tearing your hair out, the first thing you should do is build your contact list with your talk groups. Okay. The sample CODEPLUGS already have a lot of these talk groups already in there, which is why it's a good starting point. But that's when you're programming from scratch, this is the way where you want to start. Okay. The next thing you need to build is your receive groups, because again, you can't assign a receive group to a channel until the receive group exists in the receive group list. Okay. So again, receive groups are how DMR radios use talk groups when receiving signals. Talk groups are assigned to receive groups. The receive group is assigned to the receive side of your channel. And more than talk group can be assigned in the receive group. So that if you do have more than one talk group on that slot, your radio will key up and you can tell when any conversation is going on. So in those cases where you have multiple talk groups on a repeater slot, it's wise to put all of those talk groups in the receive group, so you can make sure the channel's free, or the repeater slot is free before you transmit. Okay. Remember, this stuff was built around commercial radio needs, not amateur radio. I understand, it doesn't always make sense, but that's why. Okay. Now this is what the receive groups look like in the software. It looks the same in most software. You have at the bottom there, you can see on the left side, we've got the DMR Mark Worldwide Receive group selected. And then what you have in your contact list there is the available talk groups, and then the members of the group on the right side. You just add them over in order to add the talk groups that you want to the receive group. And then you give it a name at the bottom where it says RX group list alias. That's just the name of the receive group. Okay. Do we have a question? Any questions in the chat at this point?
Nothing in the chat, Mike.
Okay, very good. So now we have our talk groups in the contact list. We've created our receive groups, and we put the talk groups we want in the receive groups in the receive group. We should now be able to start building our channel. Now again, to review, we've got some echo coming in through the thing. If you could mute, please. Thank you. We talked about repeater slots. A DMR repeater will have 2 time slots. They're also called repeater slots. They're the same thing. Okay? They share a frequency, right? I've got some background noise. I'm sorry. Hang on, folks. Trying to find it. Aha, found it. Okay. So, and again, if you're talking on one slot, somebody on the other slot can't hear you, so you need to be on the same slot. But both of these slots use the same frequency pair, and the repeater uses time division multiple access in order to keep the two conversations separate. Okay, it means the repeater can do the work of 2 in the same frequency pair. You have to know the repeater slot to use when you're setting up your radio. All right, now. I set up this table to kind of give you an overall broad view of what this looks like. Okay. Now, the top 2 channels are the same RMHAM repeater. Okay. And you can tell that because they have the same transmit and receive frequencies. Okay. You also look at the color code 7. So that's the color code to use to get into the repeater. So it's color code 7. And our first channel is called Squaw Rocky Mountain. Now, the way that we do our repeater labels is that the first part of the channel name is the mountain or the location of where the repeater is, and the second part of the channel name is the talk group that you're transmitting on. So Squaw Rocky Mountain is the Rocky Mountain talk group via the Squaw repeater. Very, very straightforward. We try, like I said, we try to keep it simple. Okay. You'll notice that Rocky Mountain is on time slot 1. Okay. So time slot 1 is the Rocky Mountain talk group. It's the only talk group that's on that repeater slot in our way of doing simple. Okay. The second channel is Squaw Central. That's the central talk group on the same Squaw repeater, same repeaters, the same repeaters frequency pair, but time slot 2. Okay. So 2 people could be talking on Rocky Mountain Central. The same time, 2 other people are talking on Rocky Mountain, talking on Squaw Central. The same time, 2 other people are talking on Squaw Rocky Mountain, even though the frequency pairs are the same. Those 2 conversations would not interfere with each other. That's what those channels look like. The next 5 channels are an example of a DMR Mark configuration. This Lee Hill repeater is no longer on DMR Mark, but I use it because it's an excellent example of a repeater that has more than 1 talk group per repeater slot. So if you look at all 5 of the bottom channels, in this example, those channels all use the same frequency pair. Okay? But if you'll notice, the worldwide English and the North America talk groups are all on slot 1, and the local and the mountain talk groups are in time slot 2. Okay? So by this reckoning, someone, 2 people, multiple people that are using the repeater locally, you cannot transmit or receive on worldwide at the same time as worldwide English. You can't transmit and receive on worldwide English at the same time as North America. You could, however, have a conversation going on North America at the same time that Mountain is having a conversation, because North America and Mountain are in different time slots. It's very, very important to understand that concept. So that's why this is up here, to kind of give that as an example. I'll let you guys look at that for a second. Any questions, please unmute or put it in the chat. Okay. Now, we have all the information we need. And if you look here, we have the information that we need. We have the color code, we have the frequency pair, the color code, the time slot, and the talk group, and by association, the receive group. Okay? So if we look at that channel again, oops, go back to the channel here. You notice now we have the color code 7. We have time slot 1. Now this says again, TRBO Denver. This is now called, TRBO Denver is the scan list. Again, we don't use that nomenclature much anymore, but that's just kind of there so you know why that's there. Look on the receive side, we have the receive frequency. And if you look at the RX group list, we have the Rocky Mountain receive group. Okay, in proper parlance, each one of the receive groups is separate. We have a Rocky Mountain receive group, which means when we tune to this channel, we're only going to receive, and the speaker will only open up for talk groups that are in the Rocky Mountain receive group. On the transmit side, we have the transmit frequency, and we have the Rocky Mountain transmit contact. You can see there's two people there in the icon next to Rocky Mountain. That means that's a group call. That's a talk group. All right, so now I'm gonna stop the share. I'm gonna go into the Anytone software, and I'm gonna kind of make this up as I go along, but we'll see how this works. Okay. So we're gonna go into our talk groups here, and I'm gonna create a new one. I'm gonna call this Rocky Mountain. It is a group call, and it is 700. Okay, so now we have our Rocky Mountain talk group here in the contact list. Now, the Anytone software separates the talk group contact list from the radio ID list. More on that in the advanced class. It's a very, very good thing. But for talk groups in Anytone, this is where you want to put your talk groups in. We now need to create a receive group. So we're going to call our receive group Rocky Mountain. Yeah. And then we're going to add our Rocky Mountain talk group to the receive group, just like that. So now we have our Rocky Mountain receive group. Here's our member list and whatnot. Okay. Now we can go over to our channels. We're going to create a new channel. We'll call this Squaw Rocky Mountain. Now, you will find this in a lot of your software that you will not be able to put the entire label in there. That's just a limit of the space of the firmware of the radio and whatnot. What we tend to do is abbreviate. The most important thing is that you understand what that label means, right? Putting the right thing into the channel name is not important as you understanding when you tune to that channel what that means. That's the most important thing, okay? I'm going to make up a frequency pair just because this is not accurate, but you know, you put in the proper frequency pair. Make sure we're on digital, make sure we're on 12.K. We'll go into that a little bit in a minute, but just take that for what it is right now. In the digital information, I need to make sure that I'm transmitting on the Rocky Mountain talk group. So I click here. The Rocky Mountain talk group that I programmed is part of this list. Double click on it, and now it shows up as your transmit contact. Again, I don't know why they didn't just go with the pull down list, but for whatever reason, this is the way they did it. So my color code is 7 for that particular repeater, as we saw from the information before. Rocky Mountain's on slop 1. We're going to do the Rocky Mountain talk group, and now that channel is pretty much complete. Couple of things on these channels as well. There's this digital encryption, okay? Encryption is there because this is being used by companies, and you don't want any, Joe Smith coming along and listening in onto their private commercial conversations. So commercial entities will implement encryption on their repeaters and things. Encryption is not compatible with the rules of amateur radio. You're not supposed to use coding or anything else in amateur radio use. So it would be, I'm not a lawyer, but it would certainly be very suggestive that using encryption in DMR on amateur radio frequencies would be illegal. Don't do it. Okay. The transmit permit here, this is kind of like a gateway into making sure that you're not doubling with people. You want to use same color code, or color code free is what it's called in other radios, for DMR channels. Okay. So what that means is that if you try to transmit and someone's transmitting on the same color code on that frequency, it'll give you a busy tone, so you don't double. Okay. Now, these radios will do analog channels. You can do analog channels with this. I mean, you just switch this over to analog and put in the proper settings. That's fine. Don't use a transmit permit setting with analog. What we've found is that all of these will be fooled by a repeater tail. So if you set a transmit permit on these, generally speaking, you will never be able to break into a conversation because the radio will not let you transmit while the repeater tail is active. So it's just the way that the commercial analog implementations work. So for analog, don't use a transmit permit. But for digital, for DMR, same color code in any tone or color code free in other radios. Okay, so that's our channel programmed. We just programmed a channel. Awesome. I'll pause here for questions at this point. And we're at 8 o'clock. We have one more important topic to go over before I go, so please hang in there. So we'll go ahead and go on, and we'll take questions at the end. The final thing you need to do to get this channel into your radio is to add it to a zone. Now, what is a zone? A zone is just a group of channels. That's all it is. Most radios, if they confirm with old commercial radio concepts, will allow you to put 16 channels in a zone, because there's a little indicator dial or a selector dial on the top that has 16 places. Okay. More modern radios will be more free form. You can have up to 32 or more, and you just select through them, and the dial just keeps going. But generally speaking, all it is, a zone is just a collection of channels. Okay? Now, only one zone can be active in your radio at a time. If you have a dual band radio, only one zone can be active per channel, or the way the Anytones do it, when you create a zone, you have a band A and band B selection of channels. It can get a little confusing, but generally speaking, only one zone can be active at any point in time. Okay? So again, on HTs, the channels in the zone correspond with the channel selection dial on the radio. You can have multiple zones. So you can have different collections of channels, and then you just select the zone for whatever use you're putting it in, but only one zone can be active at a time. Okay? You can also put a channel in more than one zone. So if you're always on this one channel, and regardless of what zone you're in, you want to be able to select that channel, you can put that channel in multiple zones. Okay. Now, once you've created your zone or multiple zones, you then upload your CODEPLUG to the radio, and then you can go through the menus and select which zone you want to have active. Okay. So let me show you that in the software. So in the software, where that is there's a zone. Selecting here may also be called zone list. And you can double click here to create a zone. We're just going to call this the home zone. And here's my channels. I'm only going to have one channel in that zone called Squall Rocky Mountain. I click OK. And now, when I upload this to the radio, I go in the menu to select the zone. I can choose the home zone. And on channel selector 1 on that radio dial will be my Squall Rocky Mountain channel. That's really all there is to it. Okay? All right, we've gone over a whole lot in a very short amount of time. This would be the general Q&A section of the presentation. So at this point, if you have any questions about what we've gone through so far, this is the time to ask. So you can put your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself in the software and ask me your question.
Richard Bush, did you have a question about receive groups?
Yeah, I did. I just wondered about those, because like on that example of Lee Hill with the multiple talk groups in same time slot, same frequency, you would put a receive group that would include worldwide English, and North America in there, so that you could tell that that channel was busy. Is that correct?
That is correct. Now, in Mike Lozano K0NGA terms, I refer to that as the proper way to program a radio. All right. Technically, the reality is that you can put every talk group in your radio into one receive group, and then just assign that receive group to all your channels. Right? If your software allows for that, technically, there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. Okay? Is it the proper way to do it, following the DMR specifications and what was intended for commercial use? No. Does it save you a lot of time and aggravation? Yes. And so when I'm programming my radio for Brandmeister especially, I use that method to keep myself sane. All right, other questions? Again, feel free to unmute yourself to ask the question, or you can type it in chat. Now, don't be afraid of asking a stupid question. It took me a while to get these concepts into my brain when I first started. So this is the time to ask those questions and get them answered.
KE0MHQ here. Let me get some feedback going. That's me causing the feedback. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I know this is might be a silly question to most folks, but DMR Mark versus Brandmeister.
Okay.
Are they just totally different networks? Because I have not been on DMR Mark.
Yes, they are. Now, we will go through when we get around to doing RMHAM-U this year, and you see the DMR presentation that I will very most likely be giving the presentation, we will go into very, very strict detail about the differences between those two. The way they approach talk groups and the way they approach linking the repeaters are very, very different.
Okay.
At the core, they are both worldwide DMR linked repeater systems, but how they handle the talk groups and linking those or whatnot are very, very different. Now, generally speaking, one particular repeater will only be on one network. There are some very, very specific examples and exceptions where you can have a repeater that you can keep a talk group and talk on multiple, Brandmeister and or DMR Mark with the same repeater. They do exist, but they're very rare. The vast majority, 99% of repeaters, will only be on one network or the other. And that's very, very true for RMHAM. If you see a repeater that has RMHAM talk groups on it, Rocky Mountain, Central, Northwest, whatever, they are not connected out to other repeater systems. And for RMHAM, the reason why we do that is that our repeater network is used occasionally, when necessary, for emergency communications. And when you're doing emergency communications, you don't need some Yahoo from from all around the United States or the world popping into your talk group and chatting up people while we're trying to do emergency communications. So our repeater network is isolated to only us for the time being. We're experimenting with some other things, but it's still experimental. But our network is just us.
Okay, thanks. I don't want to hog questions here, so if anyone wants to jump in, jump in. As part of the DMR University, is there some consideration to cover hotspots?
Yes. So again, this is RMHAM University. So RMHAM University doesn't just cover DMR, but there will be a hotspot section during the DMR presentation in RMHAM-U. Yes.
Mark your calendar for October 19th of this year. Mike doesn't know it yet, but that's when he's going to get with RMHAM University.
We call that being voluntold. All right.
Okay, well, there's going to be one question that might pop up in there, and just playing around has been multiple DMRs, hotspots.
Yeah.
2 or 3 at a time. I know it's silly and I haven't played with it yet, but I do have a pair of radios that I could do that, and I could run it on sub-channels possibly.
Yes, exactly.
If I had duplex on my hotspot. Okay, so that's the hotspot one.
Yeah.
Digital. Has anyone in the area played around with using a signal link with WinLink software and I believe maybe sound modem?
That's way, way off topic. And it's
okay. All right. Well, I tried the other night and it wouldn't even work on analog with the DMR. I initially wanted to do it over DMR, but was unsuccessful. Switched to analog and still unsuccessful. So I didn't know if that was another topic, because I know the East Network, I guess you guys were playing around with digital transmission.
Yeah, that'll be something for the RMHAM class.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, and I will stop asking questions. But thank you.
No problem. Got a couple of questions come in the chat. What is the website URL for the setup utility? It depends on which radio you have. Currently, for the Anytone software, there are 2 major organizations that sell the Anytone inside the United States. One is PowerWorks and one is Connect Systems. As of right now, for the 878, the PowerWorks has the most recent software. So if you go to the PowerWorks website, go down to software downloads at the bottom, you can download the Anytone software from there. The Connect Systems software you get from Connect Systems at their website for their radios. For Titera, you'd have to go to the Titera website. You have to go to the website for the radio that you have. Where do I find channel talk group slot information? So any repeater that's going to be on the network, like on Brandmeister or whatnot, there should be, for whatever club or individual that owns and maintains that computer, a website that gives that information. For the RMHAM repeaters, our information is at rmham.org. There is a DMR menu section on that website that has all that information in excruciating detail. Or you can download one of the CODEPLUGS, and all that information is already in the CODEPLUG for you. That was for Dennis.
Hey, Mike, let's revisit Jerry's question for a second.
Okay.
He might have been asking about that GSG software.
The GSG utility. So pick your favorite web search utility, Google, and just type in N0 GSG utility, and it will take, it should be the very, very first selection. If I stop sharing for a second and go to N0 GSG utility. Yeah, so it's n0gsg.com/contact-manager. n0gsg.com/contact-manager. In fact, maybe I can do this. Can I do this? Tell me I can do this. Ooh, I can do this. I put the link in the chat. How advanced is that? Cool. Okay. Other questions that anybody would like to ask, please feel free to put the question in the chat or unmute your mic.
Hey, Mike, this is John Gorilla. I've got a quick question for you. It's more of a very pragmatic question. I downloaded your CodePlug and have installed that on my 878. Would you say that most of the stuff that's in there is still pretty actual, or will there be a significant amount of material in there that will have changed?
The RMHAM repeater information will be accurate.
Okay.
We do not add repeaters often.
Yep.
And when we do, we immediately update the CodePlugs. And the repeater information, of course, doesn't change as well, because we don't want to be changing stuff when we're in the middle of incom. Yep. So it tends to be very static. Okay. Everything else is going to be kind of on your own, especially like the Brandmeister stuff.
Yeah.
The Brandmeister stuff can change at a moment's notice. Talk groups get popular, talk groups don't get popular, talk groups, get, whatever. There are more talk groups in Brandmeister than you can sneeze at. It's impossible to keep up with that. Yeah. So on the Brandmeister side, we just put it in an example set of what are all broadly well-known ones, like United States, the New Mexico talk group, the Colorado talk group, that kind of a thing. but we encourage you to go and find the talk groups that you want to talk on and add those in.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yep, no problem. Other questions? All right, going back a little ways to the beginning here, just to give you guys a bit of a preview of what we may be covering at RMHAM-U. The last thing is down there, scanning and roaming. We will talk about that. Scanning in most DMR radios works very, very differently than amateur radios. There's not like a bank of channels. You create lists, and then you assign lists to channels. And whatever list is assigned to the channel that you have active, you hit the scan button, that's the list of channels that will be scanned. It's very different. It can be very confusing. We'll go over that in more detail during the class. Roaming is something that has, in certain cases can certainly have some usability. Essentially, the way roaming works in most radios is you add a bunch of channels to the same roam list and you hit a button and it will listen for the repeaters, and whichever signal is stronger, it'll tune to that particular repeater. In practice, it's only useful if you want to stay on a single talk group, because if you're talking to someone, they're going to expect you on a talk group, and if you're bouncing around talk groups, there's no way that they can follow you. So it's very, very useful if you're doing an event where you're using one talk group for the event, but you're moving around and you want to always use the strongest repeater. It can be very useful for that. And as I hinted at before, we will be talking in more depth about the different repeater networks and how they work, and how you need to change your programming concepts or how you approach it, depending on which network that you're going to be talking on. Because things that work in one particular network won't really be applicable to another. We start talking about user-activated talk groups, and things get really fun very, very quickly. Okay. At this time, we will take final questions, and then we will let you guys go for the evening. Any other questions?
Well, if there are no questions, I just want to thank you again for all of your efforts, Mike. This is Willem, by the way. I pretend to be John Maxwell, but only for purposes of this presentation. Thank you again for all your efforts putting this together, not only for maintaining the code plugs and so forth, but making these presentations. It's a real service to the community, and we very much appreciate it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody, for coming out, and we hope to see you October 19th for the DMR section of the RMHAM-U. Thanks, everyone, and have a good evening.
73.